10 minutes. That's all it took for 3-year-old Angelica Lewis to vanish from her own front porch in broad daylight. No screams, no witnesses, no trace. 33 years later, nobody knows how she disappeared or where she went. This is the case that defies every rule of how abductions happen. Before we go any further into this case, I need something from you. If you believe that missing children deserve to have their stories told, that families deserve answers no matter how many years have passed, and that cold cases should never be allowed to fade into obscurity, then I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications. Because channels like Cold Crime Case exist for one reason only: to make sure cases like Angelica's never stop being investigated, never stop being discussed, never stop mattering. Your subscription isn't just support. It's a promise that these victims won't be forgotten. So do it now. Subscribe. Because what you're about to hear demands to be shared. May 3rd, 1992. Frankfurt, Kentucky. A Sunday afternoon that began like 10,000 Sunday afternoons before it. The sun hung in a hazy spring sky. The temperature hovered in the mid-70s. Humidity wrapped around the small Kentucky town like a warm blanket, the kind that made hair stick to the back of your neck and made sitting on a front porch with a glass of sweet tea feel like the only reasonable response to the weather. Honeysuckle bloomed heavy on backyard fences, filling the air with that distinctive scent that anyone who grew up in the South knows by heart. Windows stood open in houses up and down residential streets. Screen doors the only barrier between inside and out, because air conditioning was expensive, and spring breezes were free. Children played in yards. Mothers watched from porches or kitchen windows. Neighbors waved to each other. Cars rolled slowly down streets where kids might dart out chasing a ball. It was normal. It was safe. It was the kind of afternoon that makes you grateful for small-town life, for knowing your neighbors, for letting your kids play outside without fear gnawing at the back of your mind. Frankfurt, Kentucky wasn't a big city. With a population of around 25,000 people, it was the kind of place where most folks knew each other, at least by sight. The state capital, yes, but still small enough that crime felt like something that happened elsewhere. Not here. Not on these streets where generations of families had raised children, where the same houses had sheltered the same bloodlines for decades, where everybody knew everybody's business, and that familiarity felt like protection. The idea that danger could be lurking on a residential street in broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon would have seemed absurd to most residents. Stranger abductions were things you saw on the news, tragedies that happened in other places to other families. Not here, not in Frankfurt. But that Sunday afternoon would prove that geography offers no protection. That small-town life doesn't guarantee safety. That predators don't respect boundaries, don't honor the invisible lines we draw between safe spaces and dangerous ones. That evil can reach into the most ordinary moment and tear it apart. The Lewis family lived on a quiet residential street, the kind of street where kids rode bikes and drew chalk hopscotch grids on driveways, where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and kept an eye on each other's homes when someone went out of town, where the biggest concern on most days was whether the lawn needed mowing or if the forecast called for rain. The house had a front porch, like most houses on the street. Not fancy, just functional. A place to sit on warm evenings. A place for kids to play close to home while parents kept half an eye on them from inside. A space that felt safe because it was home, because it was familiar, because nothing bad had ever happened there before. 3-year-old Angelica Lewis was playing on that front porch on May 3rd. 3 years old. Still a baby in so many ways. At 3, children are beginning to assert independence, but still need constant supervision. They're curious, energetic, impulsive. They don't understand danger. They can't yet grasp that the world contains people who might want to hurt them. At 3, Angelica would have been trusting, would have gone with a friendly adult without hesitation if that adult seemed nice, seemed to have a reason, seemed to offer something interesting. 3-year-olds don't have the protective suspicion that develops later. They haven't learned to be afraid yet. Her mother was inside the house, not far away, within earshot, doing ordinary Sunday afternoon tasks. Maybe cleaning up from lunch, maybe folding laundry, maybe just moving from room to room doing the endless small chores that fill a parent's day. She wasn't neglectful. She wasn't absent. She was doing exactly what millions of parents do every day, maintaining the delicate balance between giving a child some independence and keeping them safe. Angelica was on the front porch, visible from the street, close to home, in a space that felt secure. Her mother was inside, close enough to hear if Angelica called out, close enough to check on her regularly, close enough to respond in seconds if needed. This wasn't negligence. This was normal. This was the level of supervision that was considered absolutely appropriate in 1992 for a 3-year-old playing on her own front porch in a safe neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon. If we're going to blame every parent who let a child play outside within earshot, we'd have to condemn an entire generation of mothers and fathers who raised kids with a level of freedom that seems unthinkable now. What happened to Angelica Lewis wasn't her mother's fault. It was the fault of whoever took her. Let's be absolutely clear about that from the start. Somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes passed. 10 to 15 minutes. Think about how short that time span really is. It's a commercial break during a television show. It's the time it takes to fold one load of towels. It's a phone call with a friend. It's nothing. It's a blink. And yet in that impossibly small window of time, everything changed. In less time than it takes to watch a YouTube video, Angelica Lewis disappeared. Her mother came back out to the front porch, expecting to see her daughter playing with toys or sitting on the steps or maybe having wandered to the edge of the yard but still visible, still there, still safe. But Angelica wasn't there. The porch was empty. The toys were abandoned. The child was gone. Can you imagine that moment? That split second when you look at a space where your child should be and find it empty? The immediate assumption that they've just stepped around the corner of the house or gone to see if the neighbor kids are outside. The first call of their name, casual, not worried yet. Then the second call, louder, with the first edge of concern. Then the third call, now shouting, now moving quickly, now checking the backyard and the side of the house and the street, now calling the neighbors, now feeling panic rising in your chest like ice water. And then the horrible realization that your child isn't hiding, isn't just out of sight, isn't with a neighbor. Your child is gone, simply gone, vanished in the time it took you to walk from one room to another. Angelica's mother began searching immediately. She checked every room of the house in case Angelica had somehow come inside without her noticing. She checked the backyard. She ran up and down the street calling Angelica's name. She knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen a little girl. And as those first frantic minutes passed with no sign of Angelica, with no neighbors saying, "Oh yes, she's in my backyard playing with my kids," the cold reality began to settle in. Something was very, very wrong. Law enforcement was contacted immediately. When a 3-year-old disappears, there's no waiting period, no 24 hours before filing a missing person report. Police responded within minutes, and within an hour, what had been a normal Sunday afternoon in Frankfurt, Kentucky had transformed into a massive search operation. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. Search dogs were brought in. Volunteers organized into search parties. The community mobilized with remarkable speed, because everyone understood that when a 3-year-old goes missing, every second matters. Every minute that passes decreases the likelihood of a positive outcome. The first few hours are absolutely critical. The neighborhood search expanded rapidly. Yards were checked. Sheds and garages were searched. Abandoned buildings in the area were investigated. Wooded areas nearby were combed by search parties. The hope in those early hours was that Angelica had simply wandered off, had followed a cat or a butterfly or some childish impulse, and had gotten turned around and couldn't find her way home. 3-year-olds can't travel far on their own. If she had wandered, she should have been found quickly. But as the afternoon stretched into evening and evening darkened into night, and search parties returned without finding any trace of the little girl, hope began to curdle into something darker. Because there were no signs that Angelica had wandered off. No neighbors had seen a little girl walking alone down the street. No one had spotted her in nearby yards or wooded areas before the search began. The search dogs, which should have been able to track her scent, found nothing. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the spring air. As if she had been plucked from that front porch by invisible hands and carried away without touching the ground. The absence of evidence wasn't just puzzling, it was deeply, profoundly wrong. Investigators immediately began following standard protocols for missing child cases. They interviewed the family extensively. In cases where young children disappear, family members are always the first suspects because, statistically, that's where the answers usually lie. Children who go missing are most often taken by non-custodial parents in custody disputes, or harmed by family members or close family friends, or victims of terrible accidents that families sometimes try to cover up out of panic. So Angelica's parents, her extended family, family friends, everyone in the child's immediate circle was interviewed and investigated thoroughly. Their alibis were checked, their backgrounds were examined, their relationships were scrutinized, and investigators found nothing. No custody dispute, no family dysfunction that might suggest harm, no evidence of abuse or neglect, no financial problems that might motivate a staged kidnapping, no suspicious behavior or inconsistent statements. Angelica's mother's timeline was verified by neighbors. Her account of what happened was consistent and credible. There was simply no evidence pointing to family involvement. And while that cleared the family of suspicion, it also meant the case was even more baffling. If the family wasn't involved, then what happened? The neighborhood canvassing continued over the following days. Every single house within a multi-block radius was visited. Every resident was interviewed. Did you see anything unusual that afternoon? Did you notice any unfamiliar vehicles on the street? Did you see any strangers in the area? Did you hear anything? See anyone with a child? Notice anything at all out of the ordinary? And the answers came back negative. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. No one had noticed any suspicious vehicles or strangers. It was as if Angelica had disappeared in full view of an entire neighborhood, and not a single person had witnessed it happen. This was deeply unusual. Child abductions by strangers, while rare, typically leave some trace. A witness who saw a child being pulled into a vehicle. Someone who noticed a car driving erratically or too slowly through the neighborhood. A person who heard something that didn't sound quite right. Physical evidence, like tire tracks or items dropped in a struggle. But in Angelica's case, there was nothing. The investigation had no starting point, no thread to pull. no direction to pursue. Registered sex offenders in the area were identified and investigated. Their whereabouts on May 3rd were verified. Their homes and vehicles were searched. And again, nothing. No connection to Angelica. No evidence linking any known offender to her disappearance. That should have been reassuring in some way, but it only deepened the mystery. If known predators weren't responsible, then who was? The media coverage was immediate and extensive. Local news stations ran stories about the missing 3-year-old. Her photograph was shown on television and printed in newspapers. Missing person posters went up throughout Frankfurt and surrounding areas. The case received regional and eventually national attention. In 1992, the internet wasn't what it is today. There was no social media to spread information instantly, no viral posts or hashtags, but the traditional media did its job, and Angelica's face became known throughout Kentucky and beyond. Surely, investigators hoped, someone would see her, someone would recognize her, someone would come forward with information. But the days passed, and no credible sightings emerged. The tips that came in, and there were many, all led nowhere. The FBI became involved in the investigation. Child abductions potentially crossing state lines fall under federal jurisdiction, and the FBI has resources and expertise that local law enforcement might lack. Federal agents joined the investigation, bringing additional manpower and sophisticated investigative techniques. They created profiles of potential suspects. They analyzed the case from every angle. They consulted with experts in child abduction, and they reached the same frustrating conclusion that local investigators had already reached. This case didn't fit any known pattern. It violated every expectation. It made no sense. Most stranger abductions of young children happen in what law enforcement calls transitional spaces. Parking lots, the walk between a car and a store entrance, playgrounds, parks, places where a child is briefly out of the immediate supervision of adults and where an abductor can approach without being conspicuous. The abductor waits for an opportunity, grabs the child, and moves quickly to a vehicle. The entire abduction might take less than 30 seconds. It's opportunistic, impulsive, and usually leaves at least some evidence or witnesses. But Angelica was taken from her front porch, from private property, with her mother inside the house, mere feet away. The abductor would have had to approach the house, somehow convince or coerce a 3-year-old to come with them without the child screaming or crying, and leave the area with the child, all within 10 to 15 minutes, all without being seen by a single neighbor or passerby. The boldness of it was staggering. The risk was enormous. And yet, someone had done it successfully. How? One possibility investigators considered was that Angelica knew her abductor. 3-year-olds are generally wary of complete strangers. If someone Angelica didn't know at all had approached her on the porch, she likely would have called for her mother, or at minimum been hesitant. But if the abductor was someone Angelica recognized, someone who seemed safe, someone who maybe had a plausible reason for being there, she might have gone with them willingly without alarm. This theory made sense, but it also made the case even more disturbing. It suggested that the person who took Angelica might have been someone the family knew, at least casually. A neighbor, a delivery person who had been to the house before, someone from church, someone who had established just enough familiarity to seem trustworthy to a small child. Investigators revisited everyone who had any connection to the family, no matter how tangential: co-workers, church members, store clerks the family regularly interacted with, utility workers who had been to the house. Anyone who might have seen Angelica, who might have had the opportunity to become even slightly familiar to her. Background checks were conducted. Alibis were verified. And once again, nothing. No one stood out as suspicious. No one had behavior or history that raised red flags. The investigation was spinning its wheels, chasing lead after lead, and finding nothing but dead ends. Another theory was that the abduction was planned, that someone had been watching the house, had learned the family's routine, had identified a window of opportunity, and had executed the abduction with precision. This would explain the lack of evidence and witnesses. If someone had been patient, careful, and methodical, they could have waited for the perfect moment when Angelica was on the porch, when her mother was inside, when the street was temporarily empty of traffic and pedestrians. They could have moved quickly, taken the child, and left before anyone noticed. But this theory raised its own questions. Why Angelica specifically? What would motivate someone to plan such a brazen abduction? Random predators typically act impulsively, not with this level of premeditation. And if it was planned, if someone had been watching the family, surely someone would have noticed. A strange car parked on the street repeatedly, an unfamiliar person lingering in the area. But no such observations had been reported. The investigation looked into whether there might have been a financial motive. Kidnapping for ransom is extremely rare in cases involving young children from middle-class families, but investigators had to consider every possibility. They waited for a ransom demand. They prepared the family for the possibility that someone might make contact asking for money in exchange for Angelica's return. But no demand ever came. No one called asking for payment. No note was left. If someone had taken Angelica intending to ransom her back to her family, they never followed through with that plan. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded geographically. Maybe Angelica had been taken out of the immediate area. Maybe she was being held somewhere else in Kentucky, or had been transported across state lines. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region were alerted. Angelica's information was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. Her case was shared with agencies nationwide. And still, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No bodies discovered that matched her description. No arrests of suspects in possession of a child matching her description. She had simply vanished, and the trail was completely cold. The media attention began to fade after the first few weeks. This is unfortunately typical in missing person cases. The initial surge of coverage gives way to other news, other tragedies, other stories that capture public attention. Angelica's case was still being actively investigated, but it was no longer leading the evening news. The search parties that had combed through fields and woods in the early days eventually disbanded. Life in Frankfurt slowly returned to something resembling normal, though everyone knew nothing would truly be normal again. A child had been taken from her front porch, and if it could happen to Angelica, it could happen to anyone. Parents throughout the community became more vigilant, more protective. Front porches weren't assumed to be safe anymore. The invisible radius of safety that parents mentally draw around their homes had shrunk dramatically. For Angelica's family, there was no return to normal. There was only the endless, agonizing limbo of not knowing. Not knowing if she was alive or dead. Not knowing if she was being cared for or suffering. Not knowing if they would ever see her again, ever have answers, ever be able to properly grieve or properly hope. The waiting is its own special torture. When a loved one dies, there's grief, but there's also closure. There's a funeral, a burial, a marker. The person is gone, and that's terrible, but you know where they are. You can visit their grave. You can begin the painful process of acceptance. But when someone vanishes, when there's no body and no answers, you're trapped in a nightmare that never ends. You can't grieve because they might still be alive. You can't hope too strongly because they're probably not. You're frozen in the worst moment imaginable, and time doesn't move forward. Angelica's mother continued searching. She kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been. She celebrated Angelica's birthday every year. She never gave up hope that somehow, someday, her daughter would come home, or that she would at least get answers about what happened. This kind of hope is both beautiful and heartbreaking. It's what keeps families going, what prevents them from collapsing entirely under the weight of grief and uncertainty. But it's also exhausting, a burden that never lightens, a wound that never heals. The investigation continued, though with less urgency as weeks became months, and months became years. Cold cases rarely stay at the forefront of active investigations. New crimes occur that demand immediate attention and resources. Detectives retire or move to different departments. Evidence gets boxed up and sent to storage. Witnesses' memories fade. But Angelica's case was never officially closed. It remained open, remained unsolved, remained a question mark in Frankfurt's history. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what I'm about to tell you next is going to make this case even more complicated. It's going to introduce possibilities that are somehow even more disturbing than what we've already discussed. And it's going to show you why this case has frustrated investigators for more than 3 decades. The absence of evidence in Angelica's case is perhaps its most defining and most frustrating characteristic. In nearly every crime, criminals leave evidence. They can't help it. It's actually very difficult to commit a crime, especially a violent crime or an abduction, without leaving some physical trace. Fiber evidence from clothing, DNA from skin cells or hair, fingerprints, shoe prints, tire tracks. Witnesses who saw something even if they didn't realize at the time that it was significant. Surveillance footage if the crime occurred near businesses or traffic cameras. Digital evidence like cell phone records or credit card transactions that place a suspect in a certain location at a certain time. Modern forensic science has made it increasingly difficult for criminals to operate without leaving a trail. But in 1992, many of these tools didn't exist yet, or weren't as sophisticated as they are today. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Surveillance cameras weren't ubiquitous. Cell phone records weren't relevant because most people didn't have cell phones. Digital forensics wasn't a thing, so investigators working Angelica's case had fewer tools at their disposal than detectives would have today. But even accounting for the limitations of 1990s forensic science, the complete absence of evidence was unusual. Somebody should have seen something. Some physical trace should have been left behind. The fact that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, defied probability. This led some investigators to consider whether the person who took Angelica was forensically aware, whether they had knowledge of how investigations work, and had taken deliberate steps to avoid leaving evidence. This would suggest someone with law enforcement training or military experience, or someone who had studied crime extensively. It would suggest a level of sophistication that made the crime even more chilling. Because if the abductor was skilled enough to take a child from her front porch in broad daylight without leaving a single clue, they might have done it before, and they might do it again. Investigators looked at other unsolved missing children cases in Kentucky and surrounding states, searching for patterns. Were there other cases with similar characteristics? Other children who had vanished without evidence, without witnesses, without explanation? They found other unsolved cases, because tragically there are always unsolved cases involving missing children. but none that matched Angelica's circumstances closely enough to suggest a definitive link. Some cases had superficial similarities, but when examined in detail, the differences were significant enough that connecting them would have been speculation rather than solid investigative work. One of the most painful aspects of cold cases involving missing children is the proliferation of theories and speculation that emerges over time. When official investigations don't produce answers, people fill the vacuum with their own explanations. Some of these theories are well-intentioned attempts to make sense of the incomprehensible. Others are wild speculation based on nothing more than rumor and imagination. And some are actively harmful, pointing fingers at innocent people without evidence, spreading misinformation, and causing additional pain to families who are already suffering. In Angelica's case, theories emerged almost immediately and have continued to circulate for 3 decades. Some people became convinced that a family member was responsible despite the lack of evidence pointing in that direction. Once suspicion attaches to someone, it's almost impossible to completely shake it, even when investigations thoroughly clear that person. Whispers and sideways glances follow them. Their denials are interpreted as defensiveness. Their grief is questioned. It's a terrible injustice piled on top of the tragedy of losing a child. Other theories focused on the possibility of a transient or drifter passing through Frankfurt that day. Someone not from the area. Someone whose presence wouldn't have been remarkable enough to draw attention. Someone who took Angelica on impulse and then left town before the alarm was raised. This theory has the advantage of explaining why no local suspects emerged from the investigation. If the perpetrator wasn't from Frankfurt, wasn't connected to the family or community, and never returned to the area, they might never be caught. They might have gone on to live elsewhere, might have committed other crimes, or lived a seemingly normal life while carrying the secret of what they did. This possibility is both plausible and deeply unsettling, because it suggests the case might be unsolvable without a confession or an extraordinary stroke of luck. Some people theorized about organized crime connections or human trafficking, imagining that Angelica was taken to order by criminals who sold children. This theory comes more from television crime dramas than from reality. While human trafficking absolutely exists and is a horrific crime, the kidnapping of American children from their homes for trafficking purposes is extremely rare. Traffickers typically target vulnerable populations, runaways, children in foster care who lack stable family connections, immigrants who can be more easily controlled. The brazen abduction of a 3-year-old from her front porch in broad daylight doesn't match the profile of how trafficking operations actually work. But the theory persists because it offers a narrative that makes some kind of terrible sense, even if it's not supported by evidence or probability. As years passed and Angelica remained missing, her case became one of many long-term missing children cases that families and advocacy groups refuse to let die. Organizations dedicated to finding missing children added Angelica to their databases. Her case was featured on missing persons websites. Age progression photographs were created showing what she might look like as she grew older. These images are created by forensic artists who use information about the child's appearance and photographs of biological relatives to estimate how facial features would change with age. They're remarkably accurate in some cases, helping to identify missing persons decades after their disappearance. For Angelica, age progression images were created showing her at age 10, at age 18, at age 25. Each new image was distributed with the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize her. The heartbreaking reality is that most long-term missing children cases end badly. The statistics are grim. When a child has been missing for years, the most likely scenarios are that they were killed shortly after being abducted, that their remains are in a location that hasn't been discovered, or that they were taken by someone who has since died, taking the secret of the child's location to the grave. There are exceptions. There are cases of children found alive after years in captivity. J.C. Dugard was held for 18 years before being rescued. Elizabeth Smart was missing for 9 months before being found. Sean Hornbeck was held for over 4 years. These recoveries make headlines precisely because they're so rare, so miraculous, so contrary to expectations. They give hope to families of other missing children. But they're outliers, exceptions that prove the rule rather than evidence that most cases will end well. For Angelica's family, the question of whether to hope or to grieve has never been resolved. They've existed for over 3 decades in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward, unable to let go. Birthdays are torture. Mother's Day is agony. Christmas is unbearable. Every child Angelica's age that her mother sees is a reminder of what was taken. Every milestone Angelica should have reached, every achievement she should have celebrated, every moment of life she should have experienced is marked by her absence. The investigation technically remains open. In theory, detectives are still following leads if any emerge. In practice, with no new information and no active suspects, there's little investigating left to do. The case file sits in storage, thick with interview transcripts and search reports and photographs and tip sheets, a paper monument to the exhaustive work that went into trying to find one little girl. Every few years, when new forensic technology becomes available, investigators might revisit the case to see if there's any physical evidence that could be retested. DNA analysis has improved dramatically since 1992, but you need DNA to analyze. And if there was no biological evidence collected at the time, there's nothing to retest. The case is cold, not because investigators gave up, but because they ran out of leads to follow. The impact of Angelica's disappearance on Frankfurt extended far beyond her immediate family. The entire community was traumatized. Parents who had previously let their children play outside with relatively minimal supervision became much more protective. Kids who had once roamed the neighborhood freely found themselves on much shorter leashes. Front porches, once seen as extensions of safe indoor space, were suddenly recognized as public and vulnerable. The disappearance shattered a collective illusion about safety, about the kinds of places where bad things can happen. And that illusion, once broken, could never be fully restored. Law enforcement in Frankfurt also changed how they approached child safety. Community education programs about stranger danger became more common. Parents were encouraged to teach children that they should never go with anyone, even someone they recognized, without their parents' permission. Schools implemented stricter policies about releasing children to adults who weren't on approved lists. These were all positive changes in terms of protecting children, but they were born from tragedy, from the recognition that a child had been taken and no one had been able to prevent it or solve it. The media's role in cases like Angelica's is complicated. On one hand, media coverage is essential. It spreads the word about a missing child, reaches potential witnesses, keeps cases from being forgotten. Many solved cold cases credit media attention with generating the tip that finally broke the case. On the other hand, intense media scrutiny can be invasive and harmful. Reporters desperate for new angles sometimes float unfounded theories, implicate innocent people, or sensationalize tragedies in ways that prioritize ratings over truth or the family's well-being. Angelica's family experienced both the benefits and the costs of media attention. The coverage helped spread awareness of her disappearance. It also meant living under a microscope, having their grief examined and questioned, dealing with intrusive questions and cameras at their most vulnerable moments. As the decades passed, the generation of people who remembered Angelica's disappearance when it happened grew older. Younger residents of Frankfurt might not even know the story unless someone tells them. This is one of the great challenges of cold cases. As time passes, collective memory fades. The sense of urgency dissipates. New tragedies capture attention, and cases that once dominated local conversation become historical footnotes. Organizations dedicated to missing children work to prevent this forgetting. They maintain databases, share cases on social media, create anniversaries and awareness campaigns. Because forgotten cases become unsolvable cases. If no one is looking, if no one remembers, if no one is paying attention, then whoever took Angelica has successfully erased her from the world, and that cannot be allowed to stand. Technology has changed dramatically since 1992, and with it, the tools available for investigating cold cases. DNA databases allow investigators to compare evidence from unsolved cases with samples from known criminals. Familial DNA searching, where investigators use genetic databases to find relatives of unknown suspects, has solved cases that were cold for decades. Digital forensics can extract information from old computers and phones. Social media and the internet have created vast repositories of information about people's movements and activities, and sophisticated data analysis can identify patterns across cases that might not have been visible before. But all of these tools require something to work with. They require evidence, and Angelica's case has no evidence. There's no DNA to run through databases because no biological evidence was collected. There are no digital records to analyze because the crime predates widespread digital technology. There are no surveillance cameras to review because they weren't common in residential neighborhoods in 1992. The case exists in a kind of technological dead zone, occurring too late to be solved with old-fashioned detective work alone, but too early to benefit from modern forensic science. There have been attempts over the years to generate new leads through publicity campaigns. Anniversaries of the disappearance are marked with media coverage. Reward money has been offered for information leading to Angelica's recovery or the arrest of whoever took her. Missing children advocacy groups have featured her case in their materials. And each time the case receives renewed attention, tips come in. People call with information, with theories, with possible sightings, and each tip is investigated. Detectives follow up. They track down leads, and each time, the tips lead nowhere. Someone thought they saw a girl who looked like the age progression photo, but it turned out to be someone else. Someone has a theory about a neighbor who seemed suspicious, but that neighbor has a solid alibi and no connection to the case. Someone remembers seeing something odd that day, but their memory is unreliable after so many years, colored by time and suggestion and the knowledge of what happened. The frustration of investigating a case like this cannot be overstated. Detectives want to solve cases. They want to bring closure to families. They want to bring criminals to justice. But they can't manufacture evidence that doesn't exist. They can't force witnesses to come forward if there were no witnesses. They can't solve a case through sheer determination if there's simply nothing to work with. And so Angelica's case sits unsolved, a constant reminder that some crimes are perfect in their execution, that some criminals get away with their evil, that justice is not always served. For true crime enthusiasts, cases like Angelica's are fascinating precisely because they're so baffling. We're drawn to mysteries, to puzzles, to questions that demand answers. We want to believe that every crime is solvable, that the truth always emerges eventually, that good detective work and modern science can crack any case. But reality is messier than fiction. Real crimes don't always have neat solutions. Real criminals sometimes get away with it. Real victims sometimes never get justice. And real families sometimes live with questions that will never be answered. It's important, when discussing cases like this, to remember that these aren't just puzzles to be solved. They're real tragedies involving real people whose lives were destroyed by what happened. Angelica Lewis was a real 3-year-old girl with a personality and interests and people who loved her. Her mother is a real person who has lived for more than 30 years with the unimaginable pain of not knowing what happened to her daughter. When we discuss these cases, when we speculate and theorize and debate, we need to do so with respect for the victims and their families. This isn't entertainment, even though it's presented in an entertaining format. These are lives shattered by violence, and that should never be forgotten. The question of what happened to Angelica Lewis remains unanswered. The most likely scenario, based on what investigators know and what statistics tell us, is that she was abducted by someone who either knew her or had been watching her, that she was taken a relatively short distance from her home, and that she was killed within a short time after being taken. Most child abductions by strangers end in murder, and most murdered children are killed within the first few hours of their abduction. It's a horrible reality, but it's what the data shows. If this is what happened to Angelica, then her remains are somewhere waiting to be discovered. Maybe in a wooded area that hasn't been thoroughly searched. Maybe in a location that's since been built over or developed. Maybe in a place so obscure that no one would ever think to look there. The possibility that she's been dead all these years, that she died shortly after being taken while massive searches were still underway, that she's been lying in some unknown location all this time, is heartbreaking beyond words. There's also the possibility, slim but not impossible, that Angelica is still alive. That she was taken by someone who wanted a child, who raised her as their own, who gave her a different name and a different life. This happens, though it's rare. Children have been found decades after being abducted, living under assumed identities, sometimes not even knowing they were taken. Elizabeth Smart was held captive for 9 months. J.C. Dugard was imprisoned for 18 years and had children with her captor. Sean Hornbeck lived with his abductor for over 4 years. These cases prove that long-term survival is possible, but they're exceptional. They make headlines precisely because they're so unusual, so unexpected, so contrary to what normally happens in these situations. If Angelica is alive, she would be in her mid-30s now. She would have no memory of her life before age 3. Most people's earliest memories begin around age 3 or 4, so Angelica would have little or no recollection of her biological family, of her home in Frankfurt, of the life she was taken from. She might have been told she was adopted. She might have been told her biological parents died. She might have been fed lies about where she came from. Or she might have been raised in such isolation that she never questioned her circumstances, never had reason to doubt what she was told about her identity. If she's out there somewhere, living as someone else, she might have no idea that anyone is looking for her. She might not know that she's a missing person. She might never have seen her own photograph on a missing children poster. And that possibility is perhaps the cruelest aspect of this entire tragedy. The role of public awareness in solving cold cases cannot be overstated. Some cases remain unsolved for decades until someone sees a news story, recognizes a detail, and comes forward with information they didn't realize was significant. Someone who was a child in 1992 might be an adult now, might have overheard something or witnessed something that seemed meaningless at the time, but that makes sense in retrospect. Someone who knew someone who acted strangely after May 3rd, 1992. Someone who remembers a neighbor or relative who suddenly had a small child in their life who they hadn't had before. Someone who once saw something that struck them as odd, but who never connected it to Angelica's disappearance. These people might still be out there, and they might come forward if they're reminded of the case, if they see Angelica's photograph again, if something triggers the memory of that long-ago observation. This is why cases like Angelica's need to be discussed, need to be shared, need to remain in public consciousness. Not for entertainment, though these stories are compelling. Not for speculation, though it's human nature to theorize about mysteries. But because somewhere, someone might know something. Someone might have the missing piece of this terrible puzzle. And if they never see Angelica's story, if they're never reminded that this case exists and remains unsolved, they'll never realize that what they know matters. They'll never come forward, and the case will remain cold forever. The advancements in genetic genealogy have revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years. Law enforcement can now take DNA from crime scenes and compare it against public genealogy databases, identifying potential relatives of unknown suspects. This technique has solved cases that were decades old, cases that seemed absolutely hopeless. The Golden State Killer was identified and arrested in 2018 using genetic genealogy, 40 years after his crime spree ended. Countless other cold cases have been solved using similar methods. It's a powerful tool, a game-changer in forensic science. But again, it requires DNA evidence, and there's no indication that any DNA evidence was collected in Angelica's case. If there had been biological evidence, if the abductor had left behind hair or skin cells or any other genetic material, it would have been collected and preserved. Modern investigators could then extract DNA and run it through genealogy databases, potentially identifying the perpetrator or their relatives. But without that initial evidence, the technique is useless. You can't analyze DNA you don't have. And so, this revolutionary forensic tool, which has brought closure to so many families, can't help Angelica's family unless new evidence is somehow discovered. There have been cases where construction projects or natural events have uncovered remains of missing persons years or decades after their disappearance. A body found during a highway expansion project. Bones discovered by hikers in a remote area. Remains uncovered by flooding or erosion. These discoveries can bring closure, can finally answer the question of what happened, can allow families to properly grieve and bury their loved ones. They can also provide evidence that leads to the identification and prosecution of perpetrators. Every year, unidentified remains in storage are matched to missing persons through DNA comparison. Every year, families who have waited decades finally get answers. Angelica's family lives with the hope and the dread of such a discovery. Hope because answers, even terrible ones, are better than eternal uncertainty. Dread because the confirmation that she's dead, the recovery of her remains, would make real what they've feared for 33 years. It would end the slim possibility that she's somehow still alive somewhere. It would force them to finally confront the full reality of their loss. But it would also allow them to bring her home, to give her a proper burial, to have a place to go to mourn. The complexity of these emotions, the conflicting desires to know and not to know, to hope and to accept, is something most people thankfully never have to experience. The investigators who worked Angelica's case, particularly in those crucial early days and weeks, carry it with them still. Many are retired now, but they haven't forgotten. Detectives form attachments to their cases, particularly cases involving children, particularly unsolved cases. The ones that got away haunt them. They think about what they might have missed, what they could have done differently, whether the person responsible is still out there. Some retired detectives continue to work cold cases as volunteers or consultants. They can't let go. They can't accept that evil triumphed. They keep searching for the answer that eluded them decades ago. For the community of Frankfurt, Angelica's disappearance exists now as a kind of local legend, a cautionary tale, a piece of dark history that older residents remember vividly and younger residents have heard about. It changed the town in subtle but permanent ways. It ended a certain kind of innocence. It made people more suspicious, more vigilant, more aware that terrible things can happen anywhere. To anyone, at any time. The house where Angelica lived has presumably had other families living in it over the years. Do they know its history? Do they think about what happened there? Or has enough time passed that the tragedy has faded from the property itself, leaving only the official records and the memories of those who were there? The psychological impact on the community shouldn't be underestimated. When a child disappears without explanation, it creates a collective trauma. Everyone becomes a suspect in some sense. Neighbors regard each other with new suspicion. The person who took Angelica was someone who was in that neighborhood that day. They were close enough to see the opportunity, bold enough to take it, and skilled or lucky enough to escape without being noticed. That person might have been a stranger passing through. Or they might have been someone from the community. And if they were from the community, they might still be there. They might have been at the vigils. They might have joined the search parties, hiding in plain sight, pretending to help while secretly knowing exactly what happened to the missing girl. This paranoid possibility infects community trust. It makes every interaction slightly suspect. It changes the social fabric in ways that can take generations to heal, if they ever do. The anniversary of Angelica's disappearance is marked every year by her family, and by those who remember. May 3rd is not a day of celebration in Frankfurt. It's a day of remembrance, of renewed hope for answers, of continued commitment to never forgetting. Vigils are sometimes held, candles are lit, prayers are offered, and every year, the hope that this will be the year something breaks, that this will be the year someone comes forward, that this will be the year the case is finally solved, competes with the growing resignation that 33 years is a very long time, and the likelihood of answers decreases with each passing year. Social media has created new opportunities for keeping cold cases alive. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons cases share information, discuss theories, keep victims' names and faces in circulation. True crime podcasts have covered thousands of cold cases, bringing renewed attention to investigations that had gone quiet. YouTube channels like this one make videos about unsolved mysteries, reaching audiences that traditional media might not reach. This democratization of information, this crowdsourced approach to keeping cases alive, has value. It has led to tips that solved cases. It has generated pressure on law enforcement agencies to revisit investigations. It has given families of missing persons a community of support, people who care about their loved ones even though they never knew them personally. But social media also has a dark side. Armchair detectives sometimes become convinced they've solved cases that professional investigators with access to all the evidence haven't been able to solve. They point fingers at suspects without evidence. They spread misinformation. They harass people they've decided are guilty based on nothing more than speculation and gut feeling. They treat real tragedies like puzzles to be solved for their own entertainment, forgetting that these are real people's lives they're discussing. The balance between keeping cases alive through public discussion and respecting the victims, their families, and the integrity of investigations is delicate and easily disturbed. Angelica's case has been discussed in various true crime forums and communities over the years. People who have no connection to Frankfurt, who've never been to Kentucky, who weren't even born in 1992, have studied the case, offered theories, debated possibilities. Some of this discussion is helpful, thoughtful, and respectful. Some of it is wild speculation divorced from evidence or probability. And some of it is actively harmful, accusing specific individuals without basis or spreading conspiracy theories that gain traction through repetition rather than truth. Angelica's family has had to navigate this landscape, has had to deal with well-meaning but intrusive strangers, with hurtful accusations, with the constant reopening of their worst wound every time the case gets discussed online. The question of how to memorialize missing persons is complicated. When someone dies, we have funerals, graves, markers. We have a place to go to remember them, to mourn, to feel connected to them. But what do you do for someone who is missing? How do you mourn someone who might still be alive? How do you create a memorial for a person whose fate is unknown? Some families create memorial gardens or benches. Some establish scholarships in their missing loved one's name. Some work with missing children organizations, channeling their grief into activism and advocacy. There's no right way to handle it, no guidebook for navigating this particular nightmare. Angelica's mother has kept her daughter's memory alive through all the years. She's worked with missing children organizations. She's done media interviews when opportunities arose. She's maintained hope even when hope seemed irrational. This is not weakness. This is not denial. This is survival. This is a mother refusing to abandon her child even when everyone else might have moved on. The strength required to live like this, to carry this burden for decades, to wake up every morning to the same unanswered questions, is almost incomprehensible. The reality that needs to be confronted is that some cases will never be solved. Some mysteries will remain mysteries forever. Some families will never get answers. This is a hard truth, one that conflicts with our desire for justice, for closure, for narrative resolution. We want to believe that the truth always comes out, that evil is always punished, that families eventually get peace. But the world doesn't work that way. Some criminals take their secrets to the grave. Some evidence is destroyed or was never left in the first place. Some witnesses remain silent out of fear or ignorance. And some cases, despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, simply cannot be solved with the information available. This doesn't mean we stop trying. It doesn't mean we give up on Angelica or any other missing person. It doesn't mean we accept injustice or allow cases to be forgotten. It means we acknowledge reality while continuing to fight against it. We keep sharing these stories. We keep hoping for breakthroughs. We keep supporting families. We keep pushing law enforcement to revisit cold cases with new technology. We keep believing that maybe, just maybe, the next tip will be the one that matters. The next piece of technology will be the one that works. The next anniversary will be the one when someone's conscience finally forces them to speak. Angelica Lewis was 3 years old when she disappeared. She liked dolls and cartoons and the kind of simple pleasures that make 3-year-olds happy. She had a whole life ahead of her. First days of school, first friends, first loves, graduations and career, and maybe a family of her own someday. All of that was stolen from her on a sunny May afternoon in 1992. Stolen by someone who has never been held accountable, who has never faced justice, who might have lived a normal life while Angelica's family has lived in agony. The injustice of it is staggering. The cruelty is beyond comprehension. And the fact that it remains unsolved 33 years later is a failure of the system, of luck, of the universe's fundamental fairness. But it's not a failure of effort. Investigators worked this case hard. They followed every lead. They used every tool available. The case is unsolved not because people didn't care or didn't try, but because sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes the bad guys win. And that reality is something we have to live with even as we refuse to accept it. This brings us to why cases like Angelica's matter. Why they need to be told and retold. Why they can't be allowed to fade into obscurity. First, because Angelica deserves to be remembered. She was a real person, not just a statistic. Her life mattered. Her disappearance mattered. She should not be forgotten just because time has passed and the trail has gone cold. Second, because her family deserves continued support and awareness. They're still living with this tragedy every single day. Public attention keeps pressure on authorities to continue investigating, keeps the case in the minds of people who might have information, reminds the family that they're not alone in their grief. Third, because the person who took Angelica might still be alive. They might be out there somewhere, thinking they got away with it, thinking they're safe because enough time has passed. But cold cases have been solved decades after the crime. People have been brought to justice 30, 40, 50 years later. And if the person who took Angelica is still alive, they need to know that people haven't forgotten, that investigators haven't given up, that their crime is still being discussed and still being investigated. They need to feel the weight of their guilt, need to worry that the knock on the door might come at any moment, need to understand that time doesn't erase accountability. And fourth, because someone out there knows something. Maybe they don't realize what they know. Maybe they think what they saw or heard is irrelevant. Maybe they're afraid to come forward. Maybe they've been protecting someone for 33 years, and the burden of that secret has become unbearable. These stories, when they reach the right person at the right time, can prompt action. They can trigger memories. They can give people the courage to speak up. And that's why channels like Cold Crime Case exist. That's why these stories get told over and over, because somewhere in the audience might be the person with the answer. And if there's even a tiny chance that telling Angelica's story might lead to that person coming forward, then it needs to be told. The technology that might someday solve this case might not even exist yet. Forensic science is advancing rapidly. Techniques that seem like science fiction today might be routine investigative tools in 10 years. Maybe there will be a breakthrough in analyzing old evidence that yields information that couldn't be obtained in 1992. Maybe new databases or new ways of connecting information will reveal patterns that weren't visible before. Maybe someone will develop a technique for recovering DNA from surfaces where it wasn't thought to exist. The future holds possibilities that we can't predict, and that means hope, however faint, remains rational. Angelica's mother is getting older. She's lived most of her adult life without her daughter, without answers, without closure. The fear that she might die before finding out what happened to Angelica is real and growing. This adds urgency to the case. If answers are going to come, they need to come soon. Time is running out not just because evidence degrades and witnesses die, but because the people most affected by this tragedy won't be here forever. They deserve answers while they're still alive to receive them. They deserve justice while they're still here to witness it. They deserve peace before they die. The question of what you would do if this happened to your child is impossible to answer unless you've experienced it. Most of us can't imagine the horror, can't conceive of the strength it would take to survive it. can't comprehend what daily life would be like when your child is missing and you have no answers. We can sympathize, but we can't truly understand. And that's okay. That's normal. But what we can do is care. We can pay attention. We can share these stories. We can keep missing persons in our awareness. We can be the kind of people who notice things and report them. We can be vigilant, not just for our own children, but for all children. We can build communities where kids are watched over collectively, where strange behavior is reported, where safety is everyone's responsibility. Angelica's case reminds us that danger can come from anywhere, at any time, and that no place is completely safe. But it also reminds us that communities can come together in tragedy, that people care about strangers' children, that law enforcement officers dedicate their lives to seeking justice even in seemingly hopeless cases, that families can survive unimaginable pain and continue to function, to hope, to fight. There are lessons here beyond the mystery, lessons about resilience and community, and the importance of never giving up on the vulnerable. If this case has affected you, if you've made it this far in this video, if Angelica's story has touched you in some way, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to share this video, post it on Facebook, tweet it, send it to true crime groups you're part of. Share it with people who live in Kentucky or who have connections to the Frankfurt area. Share it with people who were alive in 1992 and might remember something, because every share increases the chance that this video reaches the one person who has information, the one person who saw something, the one person who knows something, and that person might be the key to finally solving this case. Subscribe to Cold Crime Case if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Because we cover cases like this regularly, cases that deserve attention, cases that need to be solved, cases where the families are still waiting for answers. Your subscription helps this channel grow, helps these stories reach more people, helps keep cold cases alive in public consciousness. And like this video, the algorithm rewards engagement, and the more engagement this video gets, the more people YouTube will show it to, which means more potential for someone who knows something to see it. Leave a comment with any thoughts you have. If you're from Frankfurt, if you remember this case, if you have any information, no matter how small, share it. Contact the Kentucky State Police. Anonymous tips are accepted. Even if you think what you know is meaningless, let investigators decide that. Don't self-edit. Don't assume that if it was important, someone would have already reported it. Cases have been solved by tips that seemed insignificant, but that provided the missing link investigators needed. Your information might be that link. Angelica Lewis disappeared on May 3, 1992, from her front porch in Frankfurt, Kentucky. She was 3 years old. She has brown hair and brown eyes. She was wearing a pink shirt and denim shorts when she vanished. She would be in her mid-30s now. The age progression photographs show a woman who looks kind, who has her mother's eyes, who could be anyone you might pass on the street or see in a grocery store or work with every day. If you know anything, if you've ever known anything, if you suspect something or remember something or heard something that might be relevant, please come forward. Please help bring Angelica home. Please help give her family the answers they've been waiting 33 years to receive. This case remains open. The investigation continues, and somewhere, somehow, there are answers. Someone knows what happened to Angelica Lewis. Someone knows where she is. Someone holds the key to solving this mystery. And that someone might be watching this video right now. If that's you, if you have information, you have a choice to make. You can continue to stay silent, continue to let this family suffer, continue to let Angelica remain missing, or you can do the right thing. You can come forward. You can provide the information that law enforcement needs. You can be the reason this case finally gets solved. You can give a mother the closure she's been desperate for since 1992. You can be a hero in the truest sense of the word. And if you're someone who took Angelica, or if you know who took her, understand this. Time doesn't erase guilt. Technology is advancing. DNA databases are growing. Forensic techniques are improving. Cold cases from the 1960s and 70s are being solved right now using tools that didn't exist when those crimes were committed. The same will happen with cases from the 90s. The same will happen with Angelica's case if there's any evidence to analyze. And even if there isn't, people talk. Secrets come out. Deathbed confessions happen. Someone who's been protecting you might decide they can't anymore. Someone who's been silent might find their conscience won't let them stay quiet. You might feel safe now, but that safety is an illusion. Justice is patient, and it's coming. For everyone else watching, for everyone who cares about missing children and unsolved cases and families who deserve answers, thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for taking the time to learn about Angelica Lewis. She matters. Her case matters, and your attention matters more than you might realize. Share this video. Talk about this case. Keep Angelica's name alive, because that's how cold cases get solved. That's how families get closure. That's how justice eventually wins. This is Cold Crime Case. We tell the stories that need to be told. We shine light on cases that have been left in darkness for too long. We give voice to victims who can't speak for themselves. And we refuse to let time erase accountability, or silence grief, or end the search for truth. Angelica Lewis was 3 years old when someone took her. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. She deserves to come home. And until that happens, we'll keep telling her story. We'll keep searching for answers. We'll keep fighting for her. Some mysteries haunt us because they reveal how fragile safety really is, how quickly normal can become nightmare, how easily a child can disappear, how profoundly evil can hide itself. Angelica's case is one of those mysteries. It's baffling and tragic and infuriating and heartbreaking all at once. And it remains unsolved 33 years later, not because people didn't care or didn't try, but because sometimes evil is clever, and luck is cruel, and the universe doesn't always give us the answers we desperately need. But we don't stop looking. We don't stop asking questions. We don't stop hoping. Because hope is what keeps Angelica's mother going every day. Hope is what drives investigators to revisit cold cases. Hope is what might someday bring the breakthrough that solves this case. Hope is stubborn and irrational and absolutely necessary. So we hope, we share, we remember. We refuse to forget. Angelica Lewis, 3 years old, missing since May 3, 1992, Frankfurt, Kentucky. If you have any information, please contact the Kentucky State Police. Anonymous tips are accepted. No piece of information is too small. Please help bring Angelica home. Thank you for watching Cold Crime Case. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay hopeful, and never stop seeking the truth for those who can't seek it themselves.